My supervisor faked her son's cancer and got a $5,000 bonus while I was selling furniture to pay for my daughter's chemo. When I asked for 1 week off to celebrate my kid's remission, she smiled and said, "I already claimed that week for our recovery trip. I'm sure you understand." I just stared at her. That was 3 months ago. This morning, she was escorted out by security, and her hands were shaking. I used to pride myself on being the kind of nurse who put her patients' well-being above her own. Every morning I'd arrive at 5 a.m., 2 hours before my shift, just to sit with Mr. Garner, who got anxious before sunrise. When Mrs. Jolie was dying and her family couldn't afford to fly in from Mexico, I used my vacation fund to buy their tickets. During my lunch breaks, I'd teach the newer nurses how to braid hair for our female patients because looking dignified mattered even in the end. My supervisor Meredith always took advantage of that dedication. She'd assign me the toughest cases because she knew I wouldn't complain. When families wrote those glowing reviews about the compassionate nurse, Meredith filed them under her own achievements. She started presenting my pain management protocols as her own innovations at board meetings. I worked unpaid overtime constantly while she marked it as voluntary on the timesheets. Things changed when my daughter Kaylee got diagnosed with leukemia. She was only 12 and suddenly needed chemo 3 times a week. I asked Meredith for an adjusted schedule, and she made this big show of sighing and talking about budget constraints before reluctantly agreeing. She gave my easier assignments to other nurses and stuck me with only the terminal cases. The harassment started right away too. During Kaylee's very first chemo session, Meredith called me 7 times about urgent matters that turned out to be routine paperwork. She started scheduling emergency meetings that forced me to leave treatments early. One time she changed my entire weekly schedule on Sunday night, completely disrupting the treatment times we'd carefully planned around. She even started texting me photos of messy supply closets during Kaylee's spinal taps, demanding immediate reorganization. I made it work though. I compressed 16-hour shifts around Kaylee's needs and basically lived on caffeine pills. I'd hold Kaylee's hand during chemo while fielding Meredith's calls about which printer paper to order. The worst part was watching Kaylee try to be brave about it. She'd squeeze my hand when the nausea hit and whisper, "It's okay, Mom, take your call," whenever Meredith's ringtone played. Kaylee would look up at me with those tired eyes and say, "You never leave me, Mom, even when you're so tired," and it broke my heart every single time. The real betrayal came 6 months later at an all-staff meeting. Meredith stood up in front of everyone and started crying. She announced that her son had been battling cancer and she'd been keeping it private. Through dramatic tears, she revealed he was finally in remission. The entire room erupted in applause. People rushed to hug her. Management immediately offered her paid leave and bonuses for being so strong through this difficult time. I sat there completely frozen because I knew for a fact that Meredith's only child was a perfectly healthy 18-year-old freshman at State College. I'd seen him helping her move furniture 2 weeks earlier. The next few weeks were torture. Meredith received flowers and cards daily. The company newsletter ran a feature about her inspiring journey through her child's cancer battle. She won the Quarterly Courage Award with a $5,000 bonus. Meanwhile, I had to contribute $20 to her celebration fund, while still paying off Kaylee's actual medical bills. My credit cards were maxed, and I was selling furniture on Craigslist to cover copays. People constantly praised Meredith for working through such hardship. She'd dab at her eyes and talk about how difficult it was, but how her dedication to patients kept her going. And during lunch, she'd show people fake prayer cards she'd had printed with her son's picture. I wanted to scream. Kaylee finally went into remission 8 months after diagnosis. I sobbed with relief in the hospital bathroom before pulling myself together to finish my shift. All I wanted was to take her somewhere special to celebrate. Nothing fancy, just a week at the beach to feel normal again. Maybe build sandcastles and eat ice cream for breakfast. I submitted my first real time off request in 3 years, but Meredith denied it immediately. She pulled me aside and explained she was using that exact week for her son's recovery trip to Europe. The company was paying for it as part of her support package. She patted my shoulder and said she was sure I understood since I'd been through the same thing. Then she asked if I could cover her shifts while she was gone. That night, Kaylee asked me why other families got to celebrate when their kids got better, but we couldn't. She'd seen her roommate at the hospital get a Disney trip after remission. I couldn't give her an answer that wouldn't break both our hearts. I spent the next few days in a weird haze. I didn't know what to do until I saw Meredith's son posting spring break pics from Cancun during his supposed chemo. I screenshotted everything in 10 minutes. His beer pong tournaments, party pics, all dated during his fictional cancer battle. Found 3 ex-employees on LinkedIn who'd left after similar situations with Meredith. Saved every email where she'd harassed me during Kaylee's treatments. I was done being a doormat. I marched straight to HR the next morning with my folder of evidence. The receptionist barely looked up when I asked to file a formal complaint. She handed me a stack of forms and pointed to the waiting area. I filled out every page while my hands shook with anger. The screenshots, the emails, the LinkedIn messages from former employees, everything went into that complaint. The HR director called me in after an hour. She flipped through my documentation with a frown that deepened with each page. When she got to the spring break photos, she set the folder down and folded her hands. She explained that social media posts weren't conclusive evidence and reminded me that Meredith had been with the company for 15 years. She suggested I might be misunderstanding the situation due to my own stress. I left that office feeling like I'd been punched. On my way back to the floor, I passed Meredith's office where she was showing a group of nurses her cancer journey scrapbook. They were all wiping tears as she pointed to staged hospital photos she must have taken during a routine checkup. One nurse was even taking notes for her own patient advocacy presentation. That afternoon, Meredith cornered me in the medication room. She closed the door behind her and leaned against it. Her voice stayed sweet, but her eyes were cold as she mentioned hearing about my HR visit. She reminded me that she controlled the schedule, the assignments, and the performance reviews. Then she assigned me 3 back-to-back 12-hour shifts over Kaylee's birthday weekend. I worked those shifts. What choice did I have? Kaylee spent her 13th birthday at her grandmother's house while I changed bedpans and administered medications. She'd been planning a small party with her friends, her first social event since remission. Instead, she blew out candles on a store-bought cake with just her grandma there. When I finally got home, I found her asleep on the couch, still wearing the birthday dress she'd picked out weeks ago. The next week, Meredith escalated. She moved me to the night shift without warning, claiming it was due to staffing needs. This meant I'd miss Kaylee's follow-up appointments unless I stayed awake for 24 hours straight. She also started documenting every minor issue, like when I was 2 minutes late returning from break because I was on the phone with Kaylee's oncologist. I started noticing other things too. Meredith would hover near me during shift changes, listening to my patient reports, and later presenting my observations as her own insights. She began showing up during my rounds, questioning my decisions in front of patients and their families. Once, she loudly asked why I hadn't noticed a patient's slight temperature increase, even though I'd already documented it and adjusted care accordingly. My coworkers started avoiding me. Nobody wanted to risk being seen as my ally. During lunch breaks, conversations would stop when I entered the room. People who used to ask about Kaylee now looked away when we passed in the halls. The isolation was almost worse than the harassment. Then I met Joni in the parking garage. He was sitting in his car crying after his shift. When I knocked on his window to check on him, he broke down completely. Meredith had been his supervisor 2 years ago. His wife had miscarried, and when he'd asked for time off, Meredith had claimed she'd had a miscarriage too. She'd gotten paid leave and flowers while he'd been written up for missing shifts to care for his wife. Johnny showed me emails where Meredith had documented his performance issues during his wife's recovery. He'd been too scared to report it because Meredith had connections throughout the hospital administration. He'd transferred to a different unit just to escape her, taking a pay cut in the process. He still had nightmares about that time. We sat in that parking garage for an hour comparing notes. Johnny mentioned 2 other nurses who'd had similar experiences. One had quit nursing entirely after Meredith claimed to have the same rare autoimmune disease she was battling. The other had transferred to a hospital 3 towns over just to avoid any chance of working with Meredith again. I went home that night and found Kaylee doing homework at the kitchen table. She looked up when I walked in, and I saw she'd been crying. Her best friend was having a sleepover for her birthday, but it was during my new night shift hours. Kaylee hadn't asked to go because she knew I couldn't drive her. She was trying so hard to be understanding, but she was just a kid who wanted to feel normal again. The next day, I tracked down Victoria, one of the nurses Joni had mentioned. She worked in pediatrics now and agreed to meet me during her break. I wonder how Meredith memorized all those fake details about her son's cancer. Did she practice her story or write it down somewhere? The way she made that scrapbook with staged hospital photos shows she really planned this whole lie carefully. She told me about how Meredith had claimed to have lupus right after Victoria's diagnosis. Meredith had used it to get premium parking, flexible schedules, and extra sick days. Meanwhile, Victoria had been disciplined for taking time for her actual treatments. Victoria still had emails where Meredith had berated her for using illness as an excuse, while simultaneously sending department-wide messages about her own brave battle with the same condition. The hypocrisy was staggering. Victoria had started documenting everything but gave up when HR dismissed her concerns as a personality conflict. I spent my lunch break in the hospital library, researching the company's whistleblower policies. The process looked overwhelming, requiring multiple levels of documentation and review. The policy also noted that false accusations could result in immediate termination. I wondered how many people Meredith had scared into silence with that threat. That evening, Meredith announced she was organizing a charity run for childhood cancer awareness. She wanted the entire department to participate, with proceeds going to a foundation she was starting in her son's honor. She got teary-eyed talking about how the experience had opened her eyes to the need for better support systems. Everyone immediately signed up and started pledging donations. I watched my coworkers eagerly volunteer for committee positions. They designed t-shirts with Meredith's son's picture and the slogan, "Survivor Strong." Someone suggested making it an annual event. Meredith graciously accepted, wiping away tears as she talked about turning pain into purpose. I felt sick watching the performance. The charity run planning consumed the next 2 weeks. Meredith scheduled daily committee meetings during my breaks, forcing me to eat while taking notes about sponsorship levels and route planning. She appointed herself as the keynote speaker for the opening ceremony and started practicing her speech during shift changes, her voice cracking with emotion as she described watching her son battle through chemotherapy that never happened. I started carrying a small notebook everywhere, documenting each instance of harassment. When Meredith texted me 17 times during Kaylee's blood draw appointment, I saved every message. When she rearranged the supply closets and blamed me for the mess in front of the department head, I photographed the security footage timestamp showing her entering the closet an hour before my shift. The evidence pile grew thicker each day. Victoria introduced me to Sebastian, another former employee who'd worked under Meredith 3 years earlier. We met at a coffee shop near the hospital where Sebastian now worked as a medical equipment sales representative. He'd left nursing entirely after Meredith claimed to have the same rare blood disorder his daughter was fighting. She'd used it to get first choice on all scheduling, leaving Sebastian with the worst shifts during his daughter's treatment. When he'd complained, she'd written him up for insubordination and made his work life unbearable until he quit. Sebastian still had copies of the performance reviews Meredith had written during that time. Each one painted him as an incompetent nurse who used family issues as excuses for poor performance. Meanwhile, she'd been receiving accolades for working through her own fictional health crisis. He'd kept everything but never pursued action because he needed the job reference to support his family. Back at work, Meredith's campaign intensified. She started scheduling mandatory training sessions that always conflicted with Kaylee's appointments. When I requested a accommodations, she'd sigh dramatically and remind everyone how she'd never asked for special treatment during her son's cancer battle. My coworkers would nod sympathetically while I bit my tongue to keep from screaming the truth. The night shifts were unaliving me. I'd work from 7 p.m. to 7 a.m., then rush home to get Kaylee ready for school. After dropping her off, I'd try to sleep for a few hours before picking her up and helping with homework. Most days I operated on 3 hours of sleep, mainlining coffee and energy drinks just to stay upright. Kaylee started making her own dinners because I'd fall asleep at the kitchen table. One particularly brutal week, Meredith scheduled me for 5 consecutive night shifts. By the 4th night, I was hallucinating from exhaustion. I made a minor medication error, catching it immediately before any harm was done, but Meredith was watching. She documented the incident in triplicate and called an emergency meeting to discuss my dangerous negligence. She suggested I might need remedial training, implying my personal situation was affecting my work performance. During that meeting, surrounded by administrators who looked at me with disappointment, Meredith dabbed at her eyes and mentioned how she'd never let her son's illness affect her patient care. She suggested perhaps I wasn't as strong as I thought I was. The department head nodded thoughtfully and assigned me to work with a supervising nurse for the next month, essentially demoting me despite my 12 years of exemplary service. The supervising nurse turned out to be Meredith's close friend who reported every minor detail back to her. If I took an extra minute in the bathroom, Meredith knew. If I checked my phone for messages from Kaylee's school, Meredith knew. The surveillance was suffocating. I felt like a prisoner in my own workplace. I started reaching out to more former employees through LinkedIn. The pattern was always the same. Meredith would identify someone going through a personal crisis, claim to have the same issue, use it for personal gain, then systematically destroy anyone who questioned her. One woman had lost her husband in a car accident, only to have Meredith claim she was also a recent widow. Another had a child with autism, and suddenly Meredith was giving presentations about navigating the special needs system with her own autistic child. The evidence was overwhelming, but scattered. None of us had been in contact while it was happening. We'd all suffered in isolation, thinking we were alone in seeing through her lies. Now, connected through shared trauma, we started building a comprehensive timeline of Meredith's deceptions spanning nearly a decade. Kaylee's grades started slipping. Her teacher called to express concern about her falling asleep in class and missing assignments. When I explained our situation, she suggested family counseling. I wanted to laugh at the irony. How could I fit counseling into a schedule that barely allowed me to sleep? But I saw the worry in Kaylee's eyes when she thought I wasn't looking, the way she'd started apologizing for needing rides to doctor appointments. The charity run grew into a major hospital event. Local news stations wanted to cover it. Meredith gave interviews about her journey, tears streaming as she described the moment her son was diagnosed. She'd crafted an entire fictional timeline, complete with specific hospital stays and treatment milestones. The lies had become so elaborate that I wondered if she'd started believing them herself. My breaking point came during Kaylee's 3-month follow-up scan. I'd requested the morning off weeks in advance, but Meredith scheduled a mandatory department meeting for that exact time. When I reminded her about the appointment, she looked puzzled and claimed I'd never submitted the request. She produced the schedule showing I was supposed to present new protocols that morning, protocols she'd assigned me to develop just days earlier. I presented those protocols with shaking hands while Kaylee sat in the waiting room with her grandmother, scared and wanting her mother. The scan results would determine if she remained cancer-free, and I wasn't there to hold her hand. Instead, I stood in front of my colleagues explaining proper catheter maintenance, while Meredith nodded approvingly from the back of the room. My phone buzzed with texts from Kaylee's grandmother, but I couldn't check them. Meredith watched me like a hawk, waiting for any excuse to write me up for unprofessionalism. The meeting dragged on for 2 hours, with Meredith asking increasingly detailed questions about scenarios that would never occur. By the time I finally escaped, Kaylee's appointment was over. The scan was clear. Kaylee remained cancer-free. I found out through a voicemail from her grandmother, listened to in my car while sobbing with relief and rage. I'd missed one of the most important moments of our journey because Meredith wanted to prove her power over me. That night, Kaylee hugged me and said she understood why I couldn't be there, but I saw the hurt she was trying to hide. I met with Joni, Victoria, and Sebastian that weekend. We sat in Victoria's living room, surrounded by boxes of documentation spanning years of Meredith's abuse. Together, we had enough evidence to show a clear pattern of behavior, but we also knew the hospital's history of protecting long-term employees, especially those who brought in positive publicity like Meredith's upcoming charity run. We decided to compile everything into a comprehensive report. Victoria's husband, who worked in data analysis, helped us create timelines and cross-reference documentation. We found at least 12 employees who'd suffered under Meredith's schemes, though only 4 of us were willing to go on record. The others feared retaliation or had moved on and didn't want to revisit the trauma. Meanwhile, Meredith's harassment escalated to new levels. She started calling me during my few hours of sleep, claiming emergency situations that required immediate response. She'd reassign my patients mid-shift, forcing me to scramble and potentially make mistakes. She scheduled me for split shifts that made it impossible to maintain any routine with Kaylee. My daughter started spending more time at her grandmother's house. Meredith's fake illness collection reads like a twisted medical bingo card, where she's determined to win every round by stealing other people's real suffering. The woman turned workplace manipulation into an art form, complete with tears on demand and a charity run for her imaginary son's fake cancer battle. She'd pack a bag without being asked, knowing I'd probably have to work late or get called in unexpectedly. She stopped telling me about school events because she knew I couldn't attend. The distance between us grew with each missed dinner, each rushed morning goodbye, each apologetic text explaining why I'd be late again. The charity run committee meetings became daily torture sessions. Meredith would assign me tasks, then publicly berate me for not completing them to her standards. She'd share stories about her son's treatment treatment, adding new dramatic details each time. Once, she claimed he'd coded during chemo and she'd had to perform CPR. Another time, she described holding him through seizures that left her traumatized. The lies grew more elaborate and harder to stomach. I started recording the meetings on my phone, hidden in my pocket. The audio quality wasn't great, but it captured Meredith's voice spinning increasingly wild tales about her son's fictional cancer journey. It also caught her subtle threats when she'd pull me aside afterward, reminding me that she controlled my career and could make things much worse if I didn't fall in line. One night, exhausted after a particularly brutal shift, I made a serious medication error. I caught it before administering the wrong dose, but my hands shook as I realized how close I'd come to harming a patient. The exhaustion was compromising my ability to provide safe care. I sat in the medication room, surrounded by the career I'd devoted my life to, and wondered if Meredith had finally won. But then I thought about Kaylee, about all the other nurses Meredith had driven away, about the patients who deserved better than a healthcare system that allowed predators like her to thrive. I couldn't let her win. Not when so many people had suffered in silence. Not when she was using fake cancer stories to advance her career, while real families struggled through actual treatment. I went home that morning and found Kaylee awake, making breakfast for both of us. She'd set the table with the good plates, trying to make our rare morning together special. As we ate scrambled eggs in exhausted silence, she reached across the table and squeezed my hand. She told me she was proud of me for fighting so hard, for never giving up even when things got impossible. That moment gave me the strength I needed for what came next. The charity run was 2 weeks away. Meredith had arranged for her son to attend, to stand as a symbol of survival and hope. She'd ordered custom medals with his picture, planned a survivor's lap where he'd lead other cancer fighters around the track. The whole elaborate performance made me physically ill, but it also presented an opportunity. I contacted the other nurses who'd agreed to come forward. We decided to submit our comprehensive report to the hospital board the day before the charity run. We'd also send copies to the Regional Healthcare Oversight Committee and the nursing board. If the hospital tried to bury it, we'd have external pressure to ensure investigation. It wasn't a perfect plan, but it was the best shot we had at stopping Meredith's reign of terror. The documentation package grew to over 200 pages. Employment records, emails, text messages, performance reviews, witness statements, and timeline comparisons showing how Meredith's claimed illnesses always coincided with her victims' actual crises. We triple-checked every piece of evidence, knowing Meredith would try to discredit us if given any opportunity. As the charity run approached, Meredith's behavior became increasingly erratic. She seemed to sense something was shifting, though she couldn't pinpoint what. She started showing up during my shifts more frequently, watching me work and looking for any excuse to write me up. She reassigned my longtime patients to other nurses, claiming I wasn't providing adequate emotional support during my personal difficulties. The loss of those patient relationships hurt almost as much as missing time with Kaylee. I'd cared for some of them for years, knew their families, their fears, their favorite songs to play during treatment. Watching Meredith hand them off to newer nurses while claiming it was for their own good felt like another piece of my identity being stripped away. 3 days before the charity run, Meredith called me into her office. She closed the door and sat behind her desk, fingers steepled like a movie villain. She'd heard rumors, she said, about disgruntled former employees spreading lies. She reminded me that defamation was a serious accusation, that making false claims about a supervisor could end my career permanently. Her eyes never left mine as she described how difficult it would be for a single mother with a sick child to find new employment after being fired for insubordination. I sat there, spine straight, and met her gaze without flinching. I thought about every missed birthday, every appointment attended alone, every night Kaylee fell asleep waiting for me to come home. I thought about Joni's tears in the parking garage, Victoria's lost career, Sebastian's forced exit from the profession he loved. I thought about all the nurses who might suffer under Meredith in the future if someone didn't stop her now. The meeting ended with Meredith assigning me to work the night before, the day of, and the night after the charity run. She smiled as she explained it was all hands on deck for such an important event. I'd miss the run itself, of course, but she was sure I understood the importance of maintaining adequate floor coverage. After all, she said, real dedication meant putting patients first, just like she had during her son's treatment. I left her office knowing the countdown had begun. In 72 hours, either Meredith's carefully constructed lies would finally collapse, or I'd lose everything I'd worked for. There was no middle ground left. The battle lines were drawn, and only one of us would survive the aftermath. That night, I held Kaylee extra tight before she went to bed. I told her that no matter what happened in the coming days, she was my greatest achievement, my reason for fighting, my reminder that truth and love could overcome even the darkest deceptions. She hugged me back and whispered that she believed in me, that she knew I'd find a way to make things right. As I prepared for my shift, I thought about the package sitting in Victoria's safe, ready for delivery to the hospital board. Years of evidence, multiple witnesses, undeniable patterns of abuse. It should be enough. It had to be enough, because I couldn't watch Meredith destroy another nurse, another family, another life built on dedication and compassion. The next morning brought an unexpected twist. Meredith's son posted on social media about his confusion regarding the upcoming charity run. He mentioned he'd never had cancer and didn't understand why his mother was organizing an event in his honor. The post was deleted within an hour, but not before several hospital employees saw and screenshotted it. The whispers started immediately. People who donated money, volunteered time, and shed tears over Meredith's story began questioning what they'd believed. But Meredith was ready with a response. She tearfully explained that her son was in denial about his illness, that trauma affected everyone differently. She suggested perhaps he'd blocked out the memories as a coping mechanism. Some people bought it. Others looked skeptical but stayed silent. I watched the doubt spread through the department like wildfire. For the first time in months, Coworkers made eye contact with me again. A few even asked quietly if I'd seen the post. I kept my responses neutral, knowing Meredith was watching for any sign of involvement. The charity run was 48 hours away, and everything was about to change. The morning of the charity run arrived with Meredith in full damage control mode. She called an emergency staff meeting at 6 a.m., forcing everyone to come in early. Standing at the podium with red-rimmed eyes, she explained that her son's social media post was a cry for help. She described how some cancer survivors developed psychological blocks around their trauma. Her voice broke as she begged for understanding during this difficult time when her son was clearly struggling with his memories. I watched from the back row as several nurses wiped away tears. The head of oncology put a comforting hand on Meredith's shoulder, but I also noticed the skeptical glances, the whispered conversations that stopped when Meredith looked their way. The seed of doubt had been planted. Victoria texted me during the meeting. She and Sebastian were at the hospital's administrative building, hand-delivering our documentation package to each board member's office. Johnny was stationed at the Regional Oversight Committee, ensuring our backup copies reached the right hands. We'd coordinated our movements down to the minute, knowing we had one shot to get this right. After the meeting, Meredith cornered me near the elevator. Her mask of grief slipped for just a moment, revealing cold calculation underneath. She mentioned how unfortunate it would be if certain nurses found themselves under investigation for harassment and defamation. She'd already spoken to legal, she said, about employees who were spreading malicious rumors about a grieving mother. I nodded and kept my expression neutral while my heart hammered. Everything depended on the board taking our evidence seriously. If they dismissed it like HR had, Meredith would destroy not just me but everyone who'd come forward. The elevator doors closed between us, and I saw my reflection in the metal surface. I looked exhausted but determined. My shift that night was deliberately brutal. Meredith assigned me to the cardiac unit, knowing I hadn't worked there in years. She gave me the maximum patient load and scheduled mandatory documentation reviews between each round. How did Meredith's son not know about the charity run before posting on social media? The timing of his post makes me wonder if someone finally told him what his mother was doing with his name. Did he find the custom medals with his picture? The charge nurse, clearly following Meredith's instructions, shadowed my every move and questioned every decision. Around midnight, I got a text from Kaylee. She couldn't sleep, worried about how tired I'd looked that morning. She'd made me lunch for tomorrow and left it in the fridge with a note. Even through my exhaustion, her thoughtfulness made me smile. This was why I was fighting, not just for justice, but to give my daughter the mother she deserved. The charity run started at 8 a.m. while I was still finishing my shift. Through the hospital windows, I could see volunteers setting up registration tables and water stations. Meredith's son was supposedly going to lead the survivor's lap at 9. I wondered if he'd actually show up or if Meredith had another excuse prepared. At 7:30, security appeared on my floor. 2 guards and the head of hospital administration walked past the nurse's station toward Meredith's office. Through the glass walls, I watched Meredith's face change from confusion to anger to something like fear. She gestured wildly, pointing at papers on her desk, shaking her head emphatically. The charge nurse who'd been shadowing me suddenly got a phone call. Her face went pale as she listened. She hung up and hurried toward Meredith's office, but security stopped her at the door. Other nurses started gathering in the hallway, whispering and craning their necks to see what was happening. 15 minutes later, Meredith emerged flanked by security. She wasn't in handcuffs, but the guards stayed close as they escorted her toward the elevator. She kept her chin high, but I saw her hands trembling. As they passed the nurse's station, she looked directly at me. The hatred in her eyes could have melted steel. The head of administration addressed the growing crowd of staff. He announced that the charity run was postponed indefinitely pending an investigation into serious allegations of fraud. He asked everyone to remain professional and avoid speculation while the matter was reviewed. The registration volunteers outside were already packing up the tables. My shift ended in chaos. Nurses who'd donated to Meredith's fake foundation demanded answers. The oncology department head who'd comforted Meredith that morning looked sick as she realized she'd been defending a lie. People who'd covered extra shifts during Meredith's grief leave calculated the hours they'd worked while she vacationed in Europe. I changed out of my scrubs in a daze. After months of harassment and sleepless nights, it was actually happening. But I felt no triumph, just bone-deep exhaustion and relief that maybe finally I could breathe again. Victoria met me in the parking garage, and we hugged without saying anything. There would be time for words later. The next few days blurred together. The hospital launched a full investigation, interviewing every nurse who'd worked under Meredith in the past decade. Stories poured out like water from a broken dam. The woman who'd been written up for taking time off when her father died, while Meredith claimed her own father was dying. The nurse who'd been denied promotion after questioning why Meredith needed special accommodations for a pregnancy that never existed. I was called in for 3 separate interviews with investigators. They had our documentation spread across a conference table, color-coded and cross-referenced. They asked about every incident, every text message, every missed moment with Kaylee. I answered honestly, sticking to facts and dates, letting the evidence speak for itself. Meredith tried to fight back. Her lawyer sent cease and desist letters to everyone who'd contributed to the report. She claimed we'd orchestrated a conspiracy to remove her from her position out of jealousy. She even produced medical documents supposedly proving her various conditions, though investigators quickly determined they were forgeries. The breakthrough came when Meredith's son agreed to speak with investigators. He was horrified to learn about his mother's lies and provided bank statements showing he'd been healthy and in college during his supposed cancer treatment. He also revealed that Meredith had tried to pay him to play along with her story after his social media post. 2 weeks after the charity run was canceled, the hospital board made their decision. Meredith was terminated for gross misconduct, fraud, and creating a hostile work environment. They also referred the case to the nursing board for review of her license and to local authorities for potential criminal charges related to the fraudulent foundation Foundation. The announcement came during a department meeting. The room erupted in shocked conversations as people processed the news. Some nurses cried, whether from relief or anger at being deceived, I couldn't tell. The interim supervisor announced that schedules would be revised immediately, and any staff who'd been unfairly disciplined under Meredith's leadership could appeal their records. I submitted my schedule change request that afternoon. The interim supervisor approved it within an hour, apologizing for what I'd endured. She assigned me back to day shifts with the flexibility I needed for Kaylee's appointments. She also removed the remedial training requirement and the performance improvement plan Meredith had imposed. My coworkers slowly started talking to me again. Some apologized for avoiding me, explaining they'd been terrified of becoming Meredith's next target. Others admitted they'd suspected something was wrong but hadn't known how to help. A few thanked me for finally exposing the truth, sharing their own stories of Meredith's manipulation. The financial impact hit next. The hospital's legal department determined that Meredith had collected over $40,000 through her various schemes, between special bonuses, paid leave for fake conditions, and donations to her fraudulent foundation. They began the process of recovering funds and determining restitution for affected employees. I was awarded back pay for all the unpaid overtime Meredith had marked as voluntary. It wasn't a fortune, just under $8,000, but it meant I could pay off some of Kaylee's medical bills and stop selling furniture to make ends meet. Other nurses received similar settlements based on documented losses from Meredith's actions. The best part was simply having my life back. I picked Kaylee up from school on time. We ate dinner together at the kitchen table instead of in hospital waiting rooms. I slept for 8 hours straight without being awakened by harassing phone calls. My hands stopped shaking from exhaustion, and I could focus on my patients without constantly looking over my shoulder. Kaylee noticed the change immediately. She started smiling more, making plans with friends, talking about the future instead of just getting through each day. She decorated my new schedule on the fridge with stickers and drew hearts around my days off. We even started planning that beach trip we'd dreamed about during her treatment. 3 months later, I ran into Joni at the hospital cafeteria. He'd transferred back to our unit after Meredith's termination, finally able to work in his specialty again. He showed me pictures of his wife's pregnancy, their rainbow baby after years of trying. We didn't talk about Meredith, but the relief in his eyes said everything. Victoria sent me a message that she was returning to nursing full-time. Without Meredith's harassment, she could manage her lupus while maintaining her career. Sebastian had decided to stay in medical equipment sales, but was consulting with the hospital on improving their whistleblower policies. We'd made a difference, even if it came at a tremendous personal cost. The criminal investigation into Meredith continued, though I tried not to follow it too closely. I needed to focus on healing and moving forward. The hospital implemented new oversight measures and mandatory training on workplace harassment. They also established an anonymous reporting system that bypassed direct supervisors. On the anniversary of Kaylee's remission, we finally took that beach trip. Just a long weekend at a modest hotel, nothing fancy. We built sandcastles and ate ice cream for breakfast and played in the waves until we were exhausted. Kaylee fell asleep on my shoulder during the drive home, sunburned and happy. I returned to work refreshed and ready. My patients noticed the difference. Without the constant stress and exhaustion, I could give them the care they deserved. I started teaching hair braiding again during lunch breaks. I arrived early to sit with anxious patients because I wanted to, not because I was avoiding going home. The unit felt different without Meredith's toxic presence. Nurses collaborated instead of competing. People covered each other's shifts without keeping score. The interim supervisor encouraged innovation and actually credited the right people for their ideas. It wasn't perfect, but it was healing. 6 months after Meredith's termination, the nursing board revoked her license. She'd never practice nursing again. The criminal case was still pending, but I'd done my part by telling the truth. Whatever happened next was out of my hands. I had a daughter to raise and patients to care for and a life to rebuild. Looking around the unit during a quiet moment, I saw nurses supporting each other through difficult cases. I heard laughter in the break room. I watched new graduates learning with enthusiasm instead of fear. We'd survived something terrible, but we'd survived it together. The scars would always be there, but they no longer defined us. That evening, I picked Kaylee up from school and we went for ice cream. She told me about her science project and her plans for summer camp. Her health was stable, her grades were recovering, and she was just a normal 13-year-old worried about normal 13-year-old things. It was everything I'd fought for. As we walked home, Kaylee slipped her hand into mine. She didn't say anything, just squeezed gently. I squeezed back, thinking about all the hands I'd held during my nursing career, but this one mattered most. This one had given me the strength to stand up to a predator and reclaim our lives. Together, we'd found our way back to something better. All right, that's where we'll leave it for now. Appreciate you sticking with me all the way through. It's been a wild ride, huh? And hey, thanks for letting me be your sarcastic co-pilot through all the madness. If you made it to the end, drop a comment. I love reading all your comments.